Good evening. Welcome to Township Board of Trustees meeting for Tuesday, September 25th. Mr. Mansour, will you lead us in the pledge?
Sure. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
With that, I'll entertain a motion for approval of the consent agenda and the regular agenda.
Support.
Okay, it's been moved and supported. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? With that, we will move on to the future positioning and,
Citizen comments.
I'm sorry. Correct. Yes. We're moving right along here, I guess, right?
Yeah.
We will go to citizen comment, and I'll go to this side of the room, and we'll go to the back of the room. Good evening, Mr. Ert.
Good evening. You have 100% of the citizens, well, there are other citizens here, employees, et cetera. Ed, 7212 Porter Road. I just want to comment on the views, some of these articles that come out. On 8/9, it commented on a meeting that this board had back for a cost allocation study for the fire department. And it was supposed to, Mr. Malamud was presented this and expected it to be about $40,000. And he would hope that the city would agree to split the cost. And I forget what the timeline was on that study. But I just want to go on to, I see another article in the View that says that city council approved to go on with a cost study. Not a cost allocation study. I hope they are not confused about what kind of study they're getting, because we do know what the cost of the fire department are. So I hope they understand what they're getting into. And getting back to splitting the cost, it looks like this other article is saying they're getting a sliver of the cost, 20%, up to 20%. I don't know what up to means. So I don't know how that happened, and I don't know how it's happening again, just like it happens on the seats on their commission. They got 50% of the seats on the commission, but they pay 14% of the cost. They're getting 100% into this study and looking at it all and only paying up to 20% of the cost. How come they're not paying 50% of the cost? This has nothing to do with the fire department or anything. It's two partners, okay? So I don't know why that's happening. And that's all I wanted to get into. We talked about splitting the cost. I didn't know we were splitting a sliver off of the cost. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ert, and we'll probably talk a bit about the study here in a little bit. Okay, with that, now I think we're okay to move on to future positioning. And so we will move to go to board subcommittee reports, which the first item is Parks and Recreation. And the board will hear a presentation from Director Kay Edson regarding the recent value stream mapping exercise regarding the Parks and Recreation Department, facilitated also by Trustee Lonnie Atkins. So thank you to both of you for putting this together, and I know Mr. Thomas was part of that meeting as well, myself, and I found it to be very valuable, the information that was put together from that. So I hope everybody will follow along, and I think you'll learn quite a bit from what Ms. Hudson and Mr. Atkins will discuss here this evening. Good evening.
Okay, so let's see. If you don't mind, I'll start off. So, well, I wanted to thank everyone that was part of this exercise, including Kay here. So value stream mapping, part of it, just to give a little quick overview of what it is You know, we sit here and look at some of the joint agreements, and in this case, Parks and Rec. Some of these agreements are pretty complex, and you wonder all the moving parts. And sitting on the other side, you may not know that, or you may have a little bit of the information, bits and pieces, and it's tough to make an informed decision with trying to pull that together. So think of value stream mapping as pulling the puzzle together and putting some pieces in place to kind of get a snapshot of how that information flows between those 3 or 4, or in this case 4 different groups. And really, it's just an umbrella. It doesn't, you know, it's not rocket science. It doesn't necessarily solve a problem or identify one. It's just kind of mapping out what the flow of information is and maybe how we get more efficient in doing, delivering the right information to Parks and Rec to do their, to carry out their duties. So with that, I'd like to maybe start walking through the map here, Kay. If you could start with the process as you see it.
I'm assuming this is the same as what I have here.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, as Lonnie said, we just discussed kind of the process of how information is passed along, either from us to you or you to us. At the top of the map, you can see that the 3 entities that make up the commission, the township, the schools, and the city, those represent really the staff meetings or meetings that are held with those entities. So the township department heads meet every other week. So every other week, we gather and have a meeting with all the department heads present, and we pass along information about a variety of things. We're focusing on leadership a lot, and then also what is happening in each of our departments. With the schools, it's more of a as-needed basis. If there's an issue that we're having with some kind of school facility or something, we'll request a meeting with the schools. If there's something that they have that they wish to discuss with us, they'll request a meeting with me. The city, again, that represents also a staff meeting of department heads. Those meetings are more on a monthly basis, once a month. Same kind of thing. Department heads get together, share information so that everybody's kind of up to date. And if we need help from another department head for something, in those meetings, that's when that takes place. And then through my reports or our staff reports, that information is passed along to the commission at our monthly meetings. So then the next thing was to look at each entity and how, if a project comes along or an idea comes along, how that information is passed through. So I'll just start at the top with the senior center. We have a senior coordinator who is in charge basically of operating that building and the programs that go on there. If they have an idea or a project that they want to bring forward, as an example, I can't remember how many years ago it was, but we did an addition to the senior center, and that was done through the county senior millage. At that time, they had a program where each center could apply one time for funding to do some kind of upgrade or construction project at each center. So our coordinator at that time put together a list of priorities that was needed at the senior center, and I'm sorry, it was not a addition, it was
Entryway?
I'm sorry?
The entryway or something?
Well, it was just kind of an overall enhancement. We redid the floors, we took out the wood floor and put in this kind of a sheet metal floor that's easier to keep clean. We repainted, we redid some windows, just a general upgrade enhancement to the center. So she brought that idea forward. She collected some costs. We have a senior committee, subcommittee as part of Parks and Recreation. It's made up of 3 members of the commission. So the idea and the costs were taken to that committee. They reviewed it, then recommended it to the full commission to move forward with the project. So it was presented to the full commission for a vote. Once the commission approved it, then we went out for RFPs, awarded the bid, and then we managed the project. Any questions thus far?
Yes, I have a comment. At the time you were speaking of, I was on the board of the senior millage.
Yes, you were.
You remember that?
I do.
Okay, so we're on the same page.
So which one of these were you on? The subcommittee?
No, he was on the county senior millage
Oh, okay, in the county. Okay.
That was a subcommittee too, wasn't it, of the county
Well, it
board?
was like it functioned as a board.
Yes.
Okay. Now, one year, the center got up to $550,000. You remember that?
Our center?
Yes, the senior center. Here's what happened. They applied for $300,000 for remodeling or whatever, okay? Then, the addition to $250,000, they applied for the $250,000 because every center could apply for $250,000.
That was for operations,
Yes,
yes.
you remember that?
Well, I don't think it was 250. I think at the peak it was 232.
Okay, whatever it was, approximately.
The idea was 250 when they went for the millage, but that never quite materialized.
Oh, okay, so you're well aware of what I'm
Yes,
speaking of.
yes.
Okay, so now for about, how long they went on, about four years, they applied every year for $250,000. Well, you said 230, but I'm using approximately 250,000. And they got it each time they applied, each time the center applied. You aware of that?
Yes.
Okay. So this one year, when you received approximately $500,000, you guys did a lot of remodeling there.
Well, the 230 was for operations, which all the centers could apply for if they had that level of service. And then we applied for about 300,000 to do the renovations.
What do you mean, 200? What the 250,000 for operation? Sort of take a deep dive into that, because that wasn't the way it was presented. That's the only thing I'm saying. You know,
Well, those are separate applications. The 250 or actual 230,
Yes,
all the centers apply for that every year.
yes,
And that is approved based on what kind of services you offer.
yes.
If you offer the full realm of services, then you get the highest level of funding. You're considered a level 3 center.
That's correct.
Now, the renovation application is, not all centers will apply for that because they may not have a project.
That's true.
And you can only do it once. And I don't even think that exists anymore. That was in the very first time that millage passed.
You're absolutely right.
But I don't think they do that anymore.
Oh, okay. Okay, I just wanted to bring that up.
Sure.
That's all.
All right. Very good. Any other questions with regard to senior center? Otherwise, we'll let Kay continue on with the others.
Okay, for the benefit of the board, do you want to give us a little history about how the center was started in cooperation with the city and the township?
Can I
Mr. Atkins?
I'd like to
Let's go
get through
through.
the map so we don't pollute it too much, and
okay.
then if,
All right,
you know,
thank you.
just to keep the flow going, so.
Because we want to look at how these different organizations make their decisions is the bottom line. So
Okay.
thanks though, Ms. Lane. Ms. Hudson?
Okay, so for the city, as I think most of you are aware, in 1996, we went for a Parks and Recreation millage, a joint venture between the city and the township, and in August of 96, and that ballot language stated that it had to pass in both governmental units to be put in effect. It passed in the city and lost in the township by about 80 votes. So, and that was for a full mill. So in November, the commission decided to put it back on the ballot, and this time the language was that it could pass independently. So if it passed in the city, it went forward. If it didn't pass in either unit, it didn't go forward. It passed in the city and it didn't pass in the township. So that money, which generated in total over the 10 years, was about $1.2 million. So the city, with that money, renovated Physicians Park, renovated and added a lot of stuff to it, and to Russ Park. Because the millage didn't pass in both units, the original plan of all the parks coming under the Parks and Recreation Commission's umbrella for maintenance and operation, that was the plan if the millage passed in both. Because it didn't, the city parks remain under the city's umbrella and not Parks and Recreation. So the money is technically owned by Parks and Recreation, and the process has been that the city formulates a list of projects or a project, brings it to the commission. Well, I guess I'm getting ahead of myself here. They will get an estimated cost for what it is and bring it to their city council first.
So that's the first two yellow boxes with city, is that the mayor or the manager has a project that they would like to do. I think we use like an example, like an ice arena or something.
I believe you did.
So that yellow box, first yellow box would be, they would put together the information regarding what it would cost them and what have you to do that.
Right. And also discuss it with me and our staff to see, you know, what our feelings and opinions are.
Mm-hmm.
If we're basically on board, they move forward with the cost projections and take it to city council. If council is in favor, then they'll bring it to the commission for the commission's approval and support. Then it goes back to the city to go out for bid, and then they will come back to the Parks and Recreation Commission to deliver the invoices for payment. And then the city manages that project going forward because it's in their parks.
Okay.
Any questions there?
May I ask the question?
Yeah, Mr. Massey.
I see you have, at the end, the yellow block, where it says, do projects,
You've got one actually right there too, Mr. Massey, a printed copy if you'd like. It might be easier to
yeah.
read.
Thank you. Where it says project funded from Parks and Recs, the city.
Yeah.
After that, your RFPs come back in, right? When you
Yes.
receive your RFPs, who makes sure that they're secure?
The city.
So when are they open?
Whatever is listed in the RFP for bid opening. I mean, it's a sealed bid process, and then they open it, they evaluate it, and choose who they would like to award the bid, then they bring us that information and share that with us. And then again, we make the decision as to whether to move forward or not with funding.
Oh, the city chooses the supplier based on whatever criteria they use. Okay.
I don't want to, maybe we should just go to the next, but one of the things maybe we just make a note that I'd like to go back to after we cover these other two is why the Parks and Rec hangs on to is the holder of the city's millage.
That was the ballot language,
Oh, was it?
yes,
Okay. That it said specifically that the Parks Commission will
yes.
be kind of like the trustee or something for the.
Well, the idea is that it would pass in both, and we would have been the trustee of all of it.
All of it, right.
But-
Okay. All right.
Okay?
Yep.
And then I think one box that was left off there is just that the city does manage the project going forward after it's, the bid is awarded and once the project is completed.
And then they maintain it as well. Right?
Correct, that's, yeah, that's, yeah. So moving on to the township, there are ideas that come either from the supervisor or the superintendent, and actually the commission itself, as you've been aware of. And I guess really we kind of set this up if it was the same, if the township was bringing the projects to us, not as the commission bringing.
Correct.
So,
We try to do, whatever.
right, gotcha, okay. So they would again then discuss the ideas with me and our staff. We would then, instead of where the city staff takes the lead and investigates for cost, et cetera, our staff would take the lead with investigating costs and data, et cetera. That would be presented to one of our subcommittees and then to the full commission for approval. Then if the commission grants their approval, then it would come to the township board, be presented there and for approval or disapproval. Then we would go, if approved, we would go out for bids, come back to the township board for the bid award. Township supplies the funding, and then Parks and Recreation, the project's handed off to Parks and Rec to handle and manage going forward.
Questions?
Okay. Then with the schools, they really don't have projects, for the most part, that concern us. They do their own projects and on their own property. But using like the community education programs as an example, when they were deciding to close that department and wanted to hand those off to us, superintendent contacted me. We discussed it with staff, and then moved on with adopting those programs. And that's pretty much it in a nutshell.
I think one of the things we talked about too, Kay, that it might be helpful is with regard to programming, that pretty much that's internal, that, you know, discussions on, hey, we want to offer a junior football program or whatever, that pretty much that is with your staff and probably with the commission as well, right?
It's pretty much handled by staff. We get suggestions from lots of areas. People will make comments on our website, they'll send us emails, they'll call us, they'll stop in. And if we can find an instructor and a facility to host it, and you know, we'll go through and set a budget and what we will need to operate the program, how many participants we'll need to make it successful, and if we can hit those, then we'll do it.
Yes,
Just
Mr.
a
Massey.
question for the director. Does the city have representation on the commission?
Yes,
How many?
2. They have an elected city council person and an appointed resident, just like the township board.
No, I'm sorry. I made a mistake. I mean the school.
The schools has 2 representatives that they select. Their criteria basically is that they still have children in school. So it's somebody who's active in the district because they have kids of age. And they'll, you know, the superintendent usually will interview whoever the candidates are, whoever's interested, and then make a recommendation to the school board for their appointment.
So basically 2 from the city, 2 from the township, 2 from the schools, and then,
The at-large position is one that's advertised in the paper and posted on our website, et cetera, every 3 years. Then we take applications and resumes for that position, and then the commission, the 6 other commissioners interview those candidates and make a selection.
right. Okay. So you kind of see the lay of the land there. I don't know, I guess we're gonna go through, I think that's pretty much it on that part, right?
Yep. Excellent.
But I think now what we want to do is just kind of talk about, I think, is everybody clear on how the process is currently set up?
I think it'd be
Mr. Thomas?
really, I think it'd be really good for Trustee Atkins or Director Edison to walk us through the township procedure when the commission brings us a project. Because us bringing them a project hasn't happened with me being here.
Do you
When
need me
they wanna
back
do a
out there? or-
project?
Yeah. Just go ahead and run it
Yeah,
through.
will you come stand by me?
She's the expert.
How does it change that, Kay? If you come to us, I guess.
Well, what
can
we
talk
do, what we have done for the first 2 years of the millage is it starts with the staff, and we generate a list of projects. We present it to our Area and Facilities Committee. If they're in favor, or they may make suggestions to, or adjustments, and then once that's all agreed upon by the committee, then that's presented to the commission for approval. Then that is included in your budget as part of your capital projects plan. And then we go forward with bringing the projects to you with bids, et cetera.
I know, Mr. Limita, with Sue Radwan, we had outlined kind of a schedule of what we'd like to see happen with the Parks and Rec from that this value stream mapping was one of the first things I think that we wanted to try and do. I think we're probably a week or two ahead of schedule on that. But I'm not sure, is tonight when we want to kind of, I guess since we've had this presentation, we probably can talk through a little bit of what we might see in terms of if we changed kind of the process or were to discuss changing it, but.
So what are our notes back from that meeting that we did on August 23rd? And we actually had the presentation of value stream mapping to the board slated for the October 9th meeting. So we're ahead of schedule by doing it on September 25th. And then the detail was that once the presentation was over, that the board would discuss what this means for the township and how might these facts influence the vision moving forward. And then the next meeting would be, you know, in October, between October 10th and the 22nd, compile individual contributions to inform that shared vision for review and finalization on the meeting of October 23rd. She's, again, was suggested then that we use like SurveyMonkey to send something out, and if everybody's on the same page, craft that proposed vision based on the input of this, and then it still needs somebody to champion that cause all the way through. So, you know, you're right on track, and actually, I mean, you're a couple weeks ahead of time, and really it's up to now to take these findings and for the board to determine whether they want to make changes in the process as presented, and then you know, adopt those changes, and or you got till October 23rd's meeting to.
Yeah. One of the things I asked Mr. Limita is if we could hold off on any projects until we look at this and see if we wanted to alter it at all in terms of how we go about, you know, the bid process and overseeing projects and what have you. So I don't know, does anybody have any thoughts on the process, or does anybody have any questions for Kay while she's still here? Otherwise we can have a seat and not have to.
I don't have a process question.
Okay. Anybody have any questions for Kay, or?
Well,
Go ahead,
I just
Lon.
have a general
Yeah.
question. We kind of walk through it, but so, you know, if we wanted to look at bicentennial and, you know, not go back and forth picking apart, you know, quotes and priorities, do we need to take a little more control up front, would you think, similar to what the city does in terms of projects and prioritize them? Does this board need to do something a little more proactive in your mind?
Well, yeah, I mean, that would be, I think it's a waste of everybody's time for us to put together projects and then bring them here, and then where we think they've been approved, and then they're not approved. And, you know, we paid Rowe Engineering a chunk of change to do 2 projects. We're still paying them, but they're only doing 1 project.
Okay. Mr. Mansour?
So thanks. This is very helpful in terms of visualizing what goes on in the process here. There are a couple of observations that I'd like to make, and one actually, Director Edson, goes to your point. I think part of the frustration in this this flow, I think it doesn't capture the initial presentation that the Parks and Rec makes to the board in terms of its recommended projects. Because I remember you coming in and there being some kind of a master plan, and maybe there was a misunderstanding about what level of detail we were actually agreeing to in that. So I didn't really see that in here very well. The other thing that I think would be helpful is in a lot of these steps, it's not really clear who's doing what. So, for instance, some of these areas, you know, there's township boards voting on things, there's quotes coming in, but then there's this vote bid award. So I just some of these things, I think it would be maybe a little more helpful if we were saying, you know, kind of who was doing those things. Because I think that actually, frankly, is a little bit of a difference between what the city and township do.
So, for example, Mr. Mansour, present to commission under township. Basically, they're presenting to us well, present to commission means that they're presenting their findings. Right.
Right.
Right, they're presenting the investigation and the data they've collected,
kind of to themselves. And then they come together, come recommendation, then they come to us.
Right.
Then we vote. Then they go off and do work in terms of RFPs and quotes.
And then we're done.
No,
Then it comes back to us.
There you go.
the check.
So this is the point. So
Then it comes back to us.
then there's an analysis of these bids and who gets what, and then we make some kind of judgment on them and go from there.
Yeah, we could probably label it more.
Anyway,
the township,
whatever
the
it's worth.
township board awards the bids because you hold the money.
But the
Okay.
RFP is put out by,
the commission does the work there, for sure.
yeah. So anyways, yeah, I think we could probably streamline it to be more in line with the city, probably. I don't know if that's
Supervisor
something-
Bennett, I think but just going back to the initial point is that there's a section in here where annually, the Parks and Rec Commission does come forward with a proposal. Yeah,
activities.
exactly right. So these aren't coming out of the blue, so to speak,
Yep.
at us.
Okay.
It's actually kind of twice because it's also in your budget capital projects list. Plus, you're right, I have come and presented those before.
So, Mr. Limita, the next meeting we have scheduled to talk about Parks and Rec, kind of the big picture, is in October. Would that be something that we tackled, maybe discussion, and we have some time to look at this? I know for some of you, it's brand new information. But I know Mr. Lim and I have had some discussion on how we might be able to streamline this, and the board, you know, one of the things that we want Kay to be able to focus on is programming at the parks. And I think, you know, with the city, that's what they're able to focus on, because the city council is awarding the bids and overseeing whatever project. I would like to see if we couldn't possibly take on a few more projects out there, maybe even use some of our capital improvement funds to get more of it done at one time. And the millage could always pay that fund back. Is that correct, Mr. Limiter or Laddie, that we could do that?
Yeah, you can always use your capital projects funds for, if you want to fix some of the assets, or, you know, as long as it's a capital project, that's fine. You can't use it for operations, but transfer it in anytime. For example, if you wanted to revamp a pavilion or revamp a utility shed, you guys could authorize that through the budget process, authorize it to move forward. We could do it from here. We'd do the whole project RFPs, do it, and then just go out there and complete it. You can always pay yourself back through the millage funds back to replenish your capital projects fund. Since the millage that you collected was designed for specifically Parks and Recreation capital and maintenance projects, so there's not a problem with that at all.
I hope that you would still, though, listen to our staff and commission for some input. I mean, equipment is included in that, and, you know, we have some serious equipment needs, et cetera, and we are there working it every day.
Yeah. Well, I don't think we're gonna do it in a vacuum. I think our next meetings, we'll be glad to include you with, but I think there's some ways, you know, that we could streamline it, and it's obviously working with the city, with the commission, right?
Yes, there are definitely some extra steps here.
What's that?
There are definitely some extra steps here.
Right. And I think it just creates a lot of confusion for both you and our board. Mr. Lane?
Mr. Supervisor, we have created our own subcommittee things.
Yes.
And I would think you established this by working through that subcommittee. I think streamlining this process could be done by the subcommittee and brought here. I don't
That's a good
think it
point.
requires all of us to do it. I think we might all come up to the same conclusion.
Mr. Mansour?
So I have a question about the Parks and Rec, how you handle things. So we've been spending a lot of time talking about capital projects, that kind of thing, and we have millage and all that stuff that goes into that. But, you know, I would imagine that the vast amount of your time is actually spent on programming and maintenance. And so I'm just wondering, is there a time, are those programs that you provide, are they basically fund themselves, or do they ever need funding from?
The majority of them fund themselves. We
Okay.
have a couple that don't. For example, our youth theater program doesn't quite pay for itself, but we have other programs that
offset.
that. But we have, we have a recreation programmer, we have an assistant director, so a lot of mine is basically spent on capital projects.
Okay.
I mean, not that I'm not involved in programming, but that's their focus more than mine.
Yeah, I mean, take a look at the assets that we have here. We'd like to see them kind of filled. We like to have nice pavilions and nice courts and things, but we'd like to have kind of programs to go along with those. So those are kind of two pieces to go together. Thank you.
Mr. Thomas?
I think it's very, very, my fellow commissioners at Parks and Rec are not very happy that they feel like we're taking control of this, and I just want everyone to realize we're not taking control of this. What we would like to do is to get the list, the capital list again, so we have it right in front of everyone's face, and the three of us, and Scott, if you want to come and meet with us next week for the task force. But what I want to put this to rest, like what Scott and I tried to explain to the commission last week, was that like the pavilion and the cement flooring, if we did take that on, it would behoove us to do the roof, the bathrooms, all at the same time. But I think it's more important, what I'm trying to say, Kay, is if you can get us the capital list, we have it right in front of us the next day or so, so Lonnie, Earl, and myself can take a look
We actually
at it.
have that too. Yeah, Mr. Lehman probably has it right there, but I guess, for me, I think what our board is talking about is there's a balance between, gosh, I'm glad we don't have to do anything with that. Kay, you just been the commission, and I think, our board doesn't want that. I think we sense that we've kind of, what do you call it, we've thrown we've abdicated our responsibility when we do that. But because then also we're like, well, don't come to us wanting any money because we've turned it all over to you. And then there's a balance between that and, you guys are gonna do everything. Well, we're not gonna do everything, but where is that balance? And I think by looking at this chart, we're saying, how does it work for the other organizations, and how have we abdicated or made this thing more confusing than what it needs to be? And I think what we want to do, and maybe, I'm not sure if the entire Parks Commission is aware of, they're probably aware of it, but they probably have never seen it laid out like this. And I think there might be confusion all the way around that, hey, there's a totally different process here in place for the township than there was for the city. And I think part of the dilemma is getting everybody on the same page and realizing that we have 4 or 5 different ways of coming to decisions, and maybe it's helpful if everybody understands how that process works and that we're just trying to fine tune our process. It isn't that we want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We want to fine tune it, and it may look like we're grabbing everything up and saying that we're going to do everything, but I don't think anybody here pretends that we want to do that. I think we want to fine tune it to the point where the board feels comfortable with the level of control, and also the Park Commission feels comfortable with its level of responsibility and authority. So I think, whenever you give responsibility to somebody, they've got to have the authority to be able to be, to take responsibility. I don't want to give you all the responsibility to run the parks and then give you no authority, and vice versa. We have people vote for us. They gave us responsibility. We can't abdicate that. So it's finding a balance, and that's what we're doing. I don't want to say that we're not taking control, because we are, and we have the responsibility, and we've got to use our authority to use that wisely. So I think right now we're going to have a little bit of growing pains, but I think if everybody understands, if we could explain this to the Parks Commission, I think that would be helpful, Mr. Atkins and Ms. Edson, because I'm not sure everybody there from the conversations I've had with Mr. Thomas and what have you. I'm not sure I wasn't aware of this process until it was laid out for me, but I think this would go a long ways to clearing up some confusion that maybe we've had. And as we streamline it, we're not going to do it in a vacuum. We're glad to have you as part of that discussion and say, hey, would this work if we did it in this manner?
Okay.
So, yeah, Mr. Atkins.
I'd just like to add one other thing as we consider as a board what level of involvement we're going to be up front in the process and how we streamline some of this.
One of the comments that came out of that workshop that we did was, look at the city, what they do with their parks. Now, there is the financial element, we know that, but the parks are in different life cycles, and I think that was the term that was used. And you look at Bicentennial, and we focus on controlling that park in our township, which is a prize jewel for us and a lot of Genesee County. And how do we get to a point where, we're not ripping off an old Band-Aid, putting a new one on, and we make some bold improvements to really dress up the park, take it more to a premier status, whether it's advancing millage money or borrowing or whatever vehicles are in place that we have options to do that. But I think it's important to recognize that, pulling a little bit of it back in and putting some more eyes on it is pretty much to move it forward and look at some bold moves that Parks and Rec may not come to this board with, because they really don't know our appetite for spending or prioritizing those projects. So right now it's just kind of maintenance. You've went real bold on programs. There's a lot of programs out there to manage, but I think the next step is to look at going bold on our vision for our park.
And you are right about the life cycle. Bicentennial is 40 years old, and at best, the upgrades and improvements that have been made at Physician and Russ Park, at the most, would be 18 to 20 years old, and some even less than that. So that is a huge difference.
Right. Very good point. Mr. Thomas?
Just one more thing for you, Director Edson. When we say that the city millage money, that's actually in one of our bank accounts at the commission?
It's in several CDs.
Attorney Laddie, through the supervisor to you, the commissions, are they allowed to hold funds?
The commission's able to own, to have personal property and to manage money. The only thing that they can't own property, basically. So I think that them managing accounts, and they have their own accounts, they have their own tax ID number. It's an interesting, as I sit here tonight, I'm learning, like, I didn't realize that the language for the millage specifically said the Parks and Rec Commission would get the money. It's interesting to me. It's legal, but different for us.
Ms. Lane?
I was chairman of Parks and Rec when that millage went through, and we decided as a Parks and Rec Commission that rather than put it into the general operations, since it was for park improvement, that we would keep it separate so that when somebody said in the city, what did you do with this money to improve our parks? Any money that came out of the bank account had a matching motion at the Parks and Rec meeting that said, we're taking out X amount of money to do whatever, and the city commission was in agreement with what we did. And that's why the funds are still there, because we made that decision back in 1996. Otherwise, we didn't want city people to think, well, we took all their money and put it out at Bicentennial Park when the township didn't approve the millage. So that was one of the decisions the board made back then.
Mr. Atkins?
So just so I understand, I don't know the language of it. So could you, if you have the millage money and Parks and Rec is responsible for it, could you use that money to upgrade Bicentennial?
Legally, yes.
Okay.
But the agreement has always been that we would not do that.
And that's just the handshake agreement, correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
May I ask a question, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Massey.
It seems like these handshake agreements, and I call them gentlemen's agreement, we think that they carry a lot of weight. They're not worth 2 cents to me, because anybody that comes along, you just happen to be a nice person, Kay.
Well, some people might argue that.
Well, I'm telling you, anybody can come along to replace you and choose to do whatever he or she wants to. Is that correct?
Yep, that's true.
Okay, that's all, that's the point I'm trying to make. So a gentleman's agreement, a handshake agreement, is not worth 2 damn cents.
Well,
Well, in this case, with this commission, that few hand cents, it'd probably make up about $100. That 2 cents, that's how many handshake agreements are in it.
well, we're working on that. One of the things that, you heard Mr. Lima to outline what we said that we wanted to do as far as time frame. Does that work with everybody? I think it gets us to the end of the year with, probably being real close to a new agreement, or at least knowing what we want to be in a new agreement. Mr. Laddie?
Well, and that's an interesting point, because the attorneys for the schools and the city have the proposed changes that the Parks and Rec Commission had made. We had wanted them to see them and to contemplate them and also comment on them. And I am at the stage now where I need to kind of gather up their thoughts. I know that I know that there's a feeling that as far as the responsibilities, particularly long-term responsibilities, we need to change that agreement to recognize those responsibilities. And I think one of the elements for us has to do with overlapping liabilities and coverage, insurance coverage in bicentennial park. But also we need to really contemplate an employer. One of the municipal entities that's an employer, because right now we're kind of got Parks and Rec as an independent employer source, but they don't have the faith and credit of any tax collections. And so I think we've got to make a decision about that. Kind of what I envision it's something, a process that kind of ran along the lines of the fire department when the statute says you have to have an identified employer. But we don't need to be in the forefront of that, because I think, again, at the top of the chain, you'll see that we're all 3 equal entities. And I think those concerns are equally shared by those entities. So I will request information or thoughts from their counsel as far as the liability side goes, and I'll relay that to you, because I think that the timing of it is, if you guys have an end of the year target to kind of streamline this process and that agreement, I think that's a good idea.
So what if we propose that we have our task force look at a couple of things? One is to look at this value stream map and come up with maybe a proposed alternative to our current process. And then number 2, also look at, I really appreciated the work that Sue Radwan did to keep us on track with our discussion. I'd like to look at bringing her back to take on the next step or 2 of this process, just so we make sure it gets done and that we stay on target. Does that sound doable, that our task force do those 2 things? Mr. Thomas, you're on that task force.
I'd like Treasurer Guzak and Trustee Atkins and myself give it a swing before we bring her in and see.
Actually, it's you and I, or no, it's Guzak. Okay, you're right.
Yeah.
But Treasurer, you weren't at the Meet the Value Stream
No,
meeting?
Lonnie invited myself and you.
Okay, all right, okay. So you want to take a swing at the process, taking a look at that?
I'd like to take a swing. What do you think, guys?
Sure.
What do you think, or do you want to call her in?
No, I think we can
No,
take a
this
look at
part,
it.
this part here, I think you can, but I think the next part, we need to have her come in,
I think, and we
looking at the values and
call
what have you.
Director Edson and the 4 of us sit down and bang it out.
That part of it, but I think the next step of looking at what our values are and the agreement and what have you that we said we'd do, I think Sue was very helpful for that, or would keep us on track anyways.
Well, we've got our attorney to keep us on track too.
Right.
So.
Well, legally, but I'm talking about the discussion as far as values and what we want to see in the agreement and that. But let's take this, you guys can meet before our next meeting and we'll be in conversation on where we go with the next step of the plan. Okay, thanks, Ms. Hudson. The second topic under future positioning, streets and roads. One of the things that Ms. Lane then I would like to have a meeting with Mr. Massey as well, with our task force to discuss. And we're going to ask Mr. Sears, our DPW director, and Mr. Potter, our consultant with water and sewer, Mr. Leamet, our superintendent, to meet to talk about the feasibility of us establishing a policy for putting in water and sewer in those subdivisions that do a complete rebuild of their streets. It'd only be with a complete rebuilding of them. It wouldn't be, you know, putting a top coat or something like this on them. But we want to look at the feasibility of having a policy that would say that if you're going to rebuild your roads or your streets in your subdivision, then we will put in water and sewer.
They already have sewer. It's water that we're talking about.
There may be some that don't have sewer too. But,
Okay.
but anyways, look at that policy and see if it's a recommendation we'd want to make to the board. Mr. Mansour?
Supervisor Bennett, how is the funding for that? Would that be contemplated? Would that be, you know, for the installation of sewer, water? Would that be something that would come out of the township DPW funding, or would that be kind of added to the project cost?
Well, that would be what we would have to look at, and see how that funding model would work, because
Okay.
obviously, you know, for example, if we were to do it in one of the subdivisions currently considering paving their roads, the capital cost would be substantially more than what the residents' tap-in fees would pay, so even if we had 100% participation. So that's what we want the task force to take a look at and
Okay.
come up with what model would work funding that, and then bring it back to the board.
Mr. Chair.
Yes,
Just have
Mr.
a
Massey?
question for the board. Do we have a diagram of the roads and streets, which one the townships are, which ones the township is responsible for, and which one that the road commission is responsible
As
for?
far as streets and roads,
Yes.
the county is responsible for 100% of them. However, with the subdivision streets, the residents in those subdivisions are responsible for the cost of paving those streets. So for example, in the subdivision you live in,
Yes.
if you have 51% of the residents in that neighborhood petition to repave those streets, then you're gonna pay for those streets to be repaved. All the township is going to do is act as the bonding, or basically the collection agency for collecting that money and paying the bond.
So what about Cook Road?
Cook Road would be the county responsibility. Any non-subdivision road is gonna be the county. That's been our issue with, for example, Pollock Road, is that, it's really not a subdivision road, but yet it's not necessarily a primary road. It's kind of caught in between the two. Ms. Lane?
There are funds that the road commission is willing to have townships participate in. We call them our 50-50 monies. And if a township can match money, that allows certain projects to go ahead.
But those aren't
But
for
that's not
subdivision
subdivision.
streets.
No, it
Yeah.
isn't for subdivisions.
One of the things that we will need to discuss too, and we'll talk about this during our budget talks, is that the road commission is suggesting that they may have a substantially larger amount of money as an allocation for us this next year than what we've seen. Mr. Lehman, currently our allocation is in the $60,000 range.
Yeah, we have 65,000 in your 2019 budget for the 50-50 match, because that's what it's about. Projection is, and again, the budget hasn't passed the road commission yet, but they are projecting that it will be about $186,000 for Grand Lake Township.
So we have been, sticking 60,000, 65,000 into our budget for that 50-50 match. What we may have to consider, and we'll get more confirmation as we move along through the budget process, of whether or not it's going to look more like 180,000 that we're actually going to get, which if that's the case, then we would pull the money from somewhere else, and I would think this board would want to anyways. I guess that's probably a straw poll that we need to have amongst our board. If the county were to give us, allocate $180,000 towards our local roads, would our board want to match that? So we'd end up with more like close to $400,000.
I would like to see,
Mr. Thomas?
I would like to see, let me back up real quick. Superintendent, when does the county, when's their budget cut off? The same time ours is?
I believe they're on the same budget cycle calendar year that we are.
So what I would like to see us adopt is a budget that shows that we would put the 50-50 money into our budget for the 2019 year. Say we would be willing to put, as long as the money was available, 185,700, whatever it is, 186,000 for only to be used as 50-50 money. And if the money's not there, then that money at the end of 2019 would be reverted back to the unpaid liability or the OPEB, which the previous boards have done. That's what I would like to see happen. That way we're not messing around with budgeted adjustments in the middle of the year, taking the money and moving it around.
Mr. Mansour?
So, I appreciate the thought there, but as I drive around the township, I think there's plenty of roads that I think our residents would agree, you know, one way or another, whether matching funds or maybe we get a windfall, that we ought to seriously consider, you know, as we've talked about before, creating this prioritized list and then kind of, you know, knocking them off one at a time. With $50, $60, $80, $100,000, we could have taken care of the entire list of the ones that had been on there before. So let's, that'd be something that would be tangible for us to show to the, you know, the residents' dollars at work.
We do have a list from the county of, based on the Phaser ratings.
And Director Sears. Isn't Director Sears and the county, don't they work on that together?
Yeah, the Phaser rating comes
Yep.
out from the county,
Right.
yep, that rates the roads. Mr. Atkins?
I agree with Trustee Mansour and Trustee Thomas. I think, you know, we've mentioned it a lot of times to get word out to the public, but the amount of the tax dollars that go to the county versus what we keep. I think whenever there's an opportunity to collect more money back in this community from the county, whether it's through the DDA or matching road funds, providing that money is available, I'm all for it.
Mr. Lehman, as far as if we were to match that, let's say it's 180,000 roughly, we would probably pull that money from what we would put against OPEB at the end of the year, or?
It, currently what, you know, from our budget process, because that's been the directive from the board since I got here, is that we move the money, whatever's available, towards OPEB. You know, the short answer would be yes, but as you guys go through the budget, I mean, there's a lot of other opportunities that you can take a look at through this process, through the other changes that the board makes through the budget process could find $120,000 additional.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
My concern is putting the money in the budget currently when we're not certain that the county is going to actually be able to give us that 185, because part of it's predicated on whether or not they get it from the state. And so I just mentioned to Mr. Lemata that maybe we wait a little bit further along in the budget process to see if the county and the state actually are willing to, if that money's actually going to hit our roads. So.
Well, I think with that caveat of saying that it's, the $186,000 would be only as a 50-50 grant, as long as we receive the money from the county, and any money that's left over from that 186 will go back to our unfunded liability, which we've been doing.
Could we do that, Mr. Lemata, something like that?
You know, that wouldn't really deviate from what the board's directive has been from us to date, which is we match the 50-50 funds. And so really that direction from Trustee Thomas, what he just said, would not be a deviation from the directive that we've already been given by previous boards, is that, you know, we want to match the 50-50, we're going to take advantage of that free money to whatever extent possible. So from that standpoint, it doesn't impact what we've already been working on. We're
Right.
following the same path.
Okay, good.
Yeah, because we've always matched the 50/50. We've never let any money go back since I've been here. I mean, we
But
realize
what
the
trustee Mansur is saying is that we're actually showing the residents that we are actually being proactive and putting the money up front in our budget.
It's always been up front in our budget.
No, I'm talking about the road fund.
Our 50/50 money has always been in the budget every year. Mr. Leamington would put in whatever amount he feels the county's gonna put in there. If he thinks it's gonna be 186, he'll put 186 in there. He's always done that. And we've always spent all that money.
What was it is that accurate?
It's,
It was only
this,
65 before,
when
but
you were
still.
delivered this budget for September 1st, there's $65,000 allocated for the 50/50 matching funds for the roads. And that's because we had heard right before, like the week that we were pushing the budget, that there was a possibility that it'd be 186. But again, I left it at 65 because
Right.
I don't know until they pass their budget that
Right.
that is indeed the case.
I'm
But
talking 2018.
yeah, in 2018, you had 65, you had
Right.
$60,000 in there for 2018 on the match.
And then how much did they give us?
That was the full
65.
match, 60,000, so it was a 60/60.
There also is a, not to complicate things, but just as a consideration that this may occur at some point, is that townships, let's say that another township wasn't going to use their 50/50 money. For some reason, they've got $20,000 left in their 50/50 money. Sometimes that township will say, hey, Grand Blanc Township, why don't you take our 2020, or our 50/50 money, that 20,000 that's left over, you use it this year so that it doesn't go to waste. And next, because we've got a project that needs, another 20 grand or whatever, the following year, we give $20,000 of our allocation to them. That's one way that things are handled as well, so that if somebody has some leftover 50/50 money and they don't want it to go back to the county, they can say, hey, we want to loan you that 20,000 that we're going to have go to waste, so you guys will at least use it. And the following year, you guys give it back to us. So, know what I'm saying?
Mr. Chair.
Yes,
how would
Mr.
we
Massey.
know that there's available money out there?
Well, I go to the meetings and I would hear about it from the other township supervisors. They would call us or call Mr. Sears or Mr. Lehman and say, hey, we've got some extra money here. You guys want to use it? Otherwise, we're going to lose it, or we're going to go to a different township and see if they can use it.
Oh.
So. Okay, so we will keep an eye on that real closely and report back to the board on what we see happening with road funding. Moving down to, I think one of the next item, I don't know, is there anything else with the subcommittees that anybody wants to report on? Moving to the police millage. Mr. Thomas asked that we stick this on here. I guess Mr. Massey and I have had a discussion. One of the things that, and I think a couple other board members have mentioned, that you'd like to take a deeper dive into the police budget. I don't know, Mr. Massey, would you like to comment on that, or?
Yes, we would like to take a deep dive into the police budget. And at the time we take a deep dive into the budget, we'd like for the chief to be here. We may have some questions for him, cost-saving questions as we funnel through the budget. As we look at the budget with a much sharper eye than we have done in the past, to try to find cost-saving measures in the budget that we can actually save money.
Mm-hmm. So what we're saying is that we have a renewal of our police millage coming up this next year, and before we make any move towards examining what that millage should be, you would like us to take a deeper look into our current expenditures to see what we're spending and if there's any savings to be had within our current police budget.
Absolutely.
Any thoughts on Mr. Massey's concern? Mr. Mansour?
Supervisor Bennett, I agree with trustee Massey that police is probably the largest portion of the budget, DPW and others. So if I were going to spend time, if I had to prioritize it, I'd place those two at the top, given the fact that we've really combed through fire over the last year and a half. So pretty comfortable about that one.
And we're currently have a consultant combing through it. But so I think, Mr. Lehman, it's about 60% of our budget, the police portion.
Yeah, for your discretionary funds in the general fund, about 60% of it goes to law enforcement.
Right. So I think, you know, I think our residents love our police force. They love the work that they do, and it's no criticism of them, but before we look at what our next millage is going to be, we want to go through it and make sure that if there's any cost savings that we can have just by having another set of eyes or things. Mr. Lehman does a great job of, and our chief of police does a great job of holding costs down, but we want to make sure that we're doing our job. And I guess the timing for that police millage also will need to be discussed, because we have a few opportunities next year that this will have, at some point it's going to have to go before the voters next year.
Or 2020.
I don't know,
You're not
Mr.
restricted.
Laddie, what kind of time frame do we have in passing this millage?
Well, as I recall, I think doesn't the millage expire in 2019?
Yes.
And so you would be able to, if you're gonna do a renewal or increase, you would be able to in 2020, you'd be able to have that either at, well, you could even probably have it at the November election, but you could have it either anytime next year or anytime in 2020, as long as that amount was settled by December 1st of whatever year
19.
you chose, because that's when it would be collected. It's interesting, we had a discussion in Davison about the same, they're tracking essentially the same timeframes that you are. They were contemplating whether to have a renewal or an increase, and they decided that if they're gonna have a renewal, then they would just let the in-place millage expire and then just ask for it to be renewed. That would make sense, I think, for you as well. So what you want to do, I think, is figure out if you are going to ask for an increase, you may want to accelerate that millage question to 2019. Otherwise, if you're going to renew, if it's a renewal, just let it run its course and then renew it.
Okay. I think, you know, we need to take a look at not just the budget when we're considering. I'm sure our board will consider these things, but we also have some issues, I think, that are going to be presenting themselves that may cause us more work to be done, such as the one of the ballot issues ballot initiatives that'll be on the ballot coming up in November, which is the legalization of recreational marijuana. And if that passes, I think I have attended a conference with our chief of police. I appreciate him inviting me, that was held, that really outlined some scary things that, without taking position one way or the other, it will increase the work that our police force has to do. Just by mere enforcement, it will cause extra work. So I can see right now where it's going to be added work. There's no question about it. We had a little bit of added work with the tournament, with the Ally Challenge, which is a good problem to have. The Ally Challenge, you know, I think they projected is going to bring, you know, $20 million to our community. So if we have to spend a little bit extra to do that, I think it's well worth it. But those are expenses that we have as a township. Mr. Mansour?
So, regarding this topic, if you have any information you've received about what the expected impact of passage of a recreational marijuana law would be, if you could pass that along, I would certainly
Sure.
appreciate that, just to educate myself. And maybe, depending on the source of it, it's something that we ought to provide in a more broad sense, yeah.
We could be able to do that, right, Chief? I know we've received quite a bit of information from other states that have developed a track record that we can look at.
I have a question.
Yes?
I have
Mr.
a question
Atkins?
for the chief, is that?
Sure.
Not to put you on the spot, but I'm sure you have the answer to this one, so. Is there, I've heard that the Michigan State Police are trying out some sobriety field tests to detect marijuana, correct?
They are.
Have you heard of any, or do you know, I'm not too familiar with the apparatus, but I'm guessing it's not the same as an alcohol detection system, correct?
Correct.
Are there any grant dollars available to add those units? Or do you know the cost of what you may encounter there?
Potentially there would be. Before we put the cart before the horse in reference to marijuana detection and impairment of driving, it's important to remember that alcohol and marijuana are totally different beasts, and they affect the body totally different. Where in Michigan, anything above a .08 is illegal for alcohol, it is very difficult, if not near impossible, to put a number on marijuana for impairment. The best detection of impairment in a person is a well-trained police officer, not an instrument that measures saliva. When we put a number on it, it muddies the whole water because they're such a different beast, alcohol and marijuana. Alcohol is the exception. Marijuana and other drugs are the majority to how they should be enforced and dealt with impairment-wise.
Okay. Wasn't real familiar how that's progressing or being managed, but.
And that's something the legislature has not brought up or discussed about impairment of those drugs.
Okay, interesting.
Chief, we have several people who are, I don't know, would you call them experts in this area on our police force?
I would. We have, so there's several levels of training. The basic entry level, every police officer coming out of an academy is SFST, or standardized field sobriety testing.
Is that microphone on, Chief?
Yes.
Okay.
Those are standardized tests recognized through science to detect impairment from alcohol and some drugs. Above that is ARIDE, Advanced Roadside Detection Enforcement. We are one of very few, if not the only department in the state of Michigan where every sworn police officer is trained in ARIDE. We were by far the first, and maybe one or two small departments have caught it and trained up all their people. Specifically, those are standardized tests to detect drug impairment in drivers. One of the reasons why we're so successful in taking drunk and drug drivers off the roads is because of the training that our officers have and the way they enforce the laws out on the road and when they detect someone. You know, drugs, you don't smell drugs a lot of the time. Marijuana is the exception to that, of course. But you don't smell that. You have to use the tools and the training you have to detect that, and our officers are very well trained and able to do that. On top of that is drug recognition expert. We have 3 drug recognition experts in our department. Wes Evans was a founding member of the steering committee for the program in the state of Michigan. He's been declared an expert witness in courts across the state of Michigan to testify on the effects of drugs on people, not only in Genesee County, but Wayne County, Oakland County, courts up north. Prosecutor's office frequently calls Officer Evans and says, hey, we got this case. The investigation maybe wasn't what it was. Can you take a look at it and see if you can put your DRE expertise to it to make a case for us? And he's done that several times successfully. He is a wealth of information. He is the go-to guy in the region, not just the state, and we're lucky to have him here at our department.
So we're not going into this blindly when we say there's going to be concern and extra cost. We have experts on our staff that are well aware of, you know, and when we say that this isn't just like alcohol, we know what we're talking about then.
Absolutely. You know, and one of the best indicators is to see how other states have dealt with this and what they've encountered. And some of the documentation and articles that Supervisor Bennett is referring to, I can certainly forward. I got a bunch of it. And increased problems seem to arise in states where marijuana has been legalized, whether it's the black market, increased crashes, increased fatalities, youngsters getting hooked on the drug or starting the drug at a younger age. Across the board, there's increases in areas that will make law enforcement much more difficult in the state of Michigan.
Do you see it affecting your budget if this law is passed?
There's no doubt.
Okay. Any other questions for the chief? So those are, I just bring that up because in terms of, you know, scrutinizing the budget, it's going to be looking at what factors we're facing that in our local environment that could cause us to have to spend more money on police Okay, thank you, Chief. Next item on the agenda is, under operational issues, the board will consider a motion to adopt the Downtown Development Authority ordinance, creating a DDA and designating the boundaries of the district. Mr. Laddie?
Well, we talked about it last time we met, and one of the directions from the board was to add a section that identifies the responsibility of the then current township board to dissolve the authority once the authority's completed the purposes for which it was organized. That is language that comes directly from the statute. I included that in your draft, and it's highlighted. Actually, it's under section 10. And in addition, following our conversations 2 weeks ago, I added a bullet point number 3, which is also highlighted, that among the powers of the authority, in addition to those listed by the law and the statute, we want them to create and implement a development plan and a TIF plan. That is that's a power they already had, but we want to. I'm considering these bullet points as priorities communicated by us to them. I think the next step for you, if you decide to adopt this is your second reading, and so we would publish this in the paper again. We would send a copy of it to the Secretary of State. The next step for us would be for you to consider Supervisor Bennett's nominations to the Board of Directors. Once that's accomplished, the Board of Directors can meet. They can begin to formulate. They can choose their officers. They can begin to formulate their bylaws, which you'll have the opportunity to approve. The other thing, though, that we were worried about was the timing of implementing a TIF plan and a development plan, and we are getting some preliminary information from Rowe Engineering that perhaps we have until May of next year to implement those plans, and those plans we'll adopt them by ordinances, and you have the responsibility to adopt them. But they can relate back to December 31st of 2017 if adopted by May of next year. The problem is, even though we've got a 5-month reprieve from our deadline, we have other deadline responsibilities that we have to meet, including the possibility of creating a citizens council, which would be a group of folks who would act as in an advisory capacity to the Board of Directors that are made up of just residents who live in the community. And we're trying to figure out if we fall under that requirement, because under the statute, if you have a development area, not the entire downtown development district, but if you have a development area that has more than 100 residents in it, then you have to form this committee. And if you form that committee, then they have at least a 60-day period of time to review the proposed development plan and TIF plan. So if you hit the ground running, let's say hypothetically you got a TIF plan and development plan created by the Board of Directors by January. If you've got to wait 60 days to have a citizens council review it, that's taking you into March, and we've got April and May to implement. So we want to keep our pace up. We think we've got an additional 4 months. I think by preliminary indications, Rose says that they believe that the development area is something different than the district itself. And so if we are going to target our proposed improvements to certain areas, we'll know if those areas include residential properties with residents in them. And I think we'll probably be able to not form that citizens council, which would, again, save us a 60-day review period. Nonetheless, though, taking us to tonight, this is your second reading. If it meets with your approval, you will be creating the authority. You'll be formalizing the district map, and you will be authorizing your superintendent to put forward nominations for the Board of Directors.
Supervisor.
Supervisor, I'm sorry.
So moved, Mr. Chairman, that we adopt the second reading, and it would be by resolution, not a motion, of the DDA ordinance.
Mr. Massey?
Chip, I didn't quite understand you, attorney. I didn't understand you clearly when you said about the dissolving part after the task is completed.
Well, the statute, when we talked about this a couple weeks ago, we were concerned about this entity having an indefinite lifespan.
Yes.
And we went through, I was explaining at that time that the statute has a requirement that that the then township board, and however long, the life of the development plan and the DDA really has to do with what kind of scale we have for the improvements, but also what sort of timeline we have for the creation of the improvements, but also raising the money to fund them. And so that's why you have a real open end for the termination of the DDA. But once you've reached the end, once you've run out of projects, you've funded them all with the money, you've paid back all your debts, then you've accomplished your mission, right? And so the then township board has to dissolve the DDA. Any assets that are left over would fall back to the township board. So this is the best I can do for you, short of putting saying in 2060, you self-destruct. We can't do that. But you'll get a pretty good idea of again, the development plan will lay out all the possible projects for you, and it'll also lay out a potential timeline. And the timeline's gonna be dictated by how quickly we can raise money, which has to do with how quickly the area grows and how much tax we recover. So you'll get an idea of what its useful life will be but you have to make a couple assumptions about how quickly it can be accomplished.
So, Mr. Chair,
Yes.
are you saying that we, at some point in the project, we can make that determination prior to the end of the project?
No, you're only gonna be able to describe the project, the scope of the projects, and the priority of the projects. And obviously, if you have 100 projects that cost a lot of money, it's gonna take a lot more time to accomplish. If you have 5 projects that cost $100,000, you'll be done in a year, right? So you'll get an idea of how big the mission is. And then again, the other side of the coin will be, how much money do you want to throw at it? Do you want to bond for it? Will there be revenue bonds available? And how much money are you able to keep because of the tax increment financing? That's the unknown. That's the one part you're not going to be able to control.
It's like making a rule for when your kids have to move out of your house, right?
You don't.
Yeah,
You don't make that rule.
You can use any measurement except time. I mean,
And the thing is that, as long as the county's willing to allow us to use that tax dollars to improve that area, it's kind of like, why would we want to dissolve that? But the county, or the township board has that authority to dissolve it whenever we see fit, so.
Once it's met its mission, or once it's met its goals, and I think they use, once it's completed the purposes for which it was organized.
Right.
And I think, in my opinion, you can, by the way, future boards can amend that development plan and that TIF plan, and you can too. But I would think you're gonna get a really good vision of what you want to accomplish. And you're gonna have the shopping list that goes along with that. And so you're really, by all accounts, gonna be defining what it is and how long it lasts.
Mr. Mansour?
So that was, I guess, going to be my point. When we, as a board, have an opportunity to approve a plan, the content of that plan we can tailor. We can tailor. And then at later time, if we decide to expand or to change its scope, we can do that, probably on an annual basis.
I don't know if you'll be able, I don't know if you want to do it annually, because you have to go through the same review process and hearing process and adoption process. But you could easily, if you want to do it every year, you could.
But there's opportunity, basically.
Correct.
If we felt the need to do that.
Correct.
Let me ask one more question about this. So I don't think I fully understood what you were saying about this, the area of population, 100 people. Are you saying that the way this is constructed is that we can kind of parcel out the DDA and select what portions of it have the 100, or aren't we obliged to take the full, acreage, the boundaries, and people within that?
No, that's the interesting thing about it. The statute defines what a DDA is, what a Downtown Development Authority is. It lets you define the boundaries of the district itself. Mm-hmm. But then when it talks about the Citizens Council, it flips back to referring to a development area. And then the main section of that statute that talks about a development area is in the development plan. And so when you read that, because they've made a distinction, they could have easily said, if there are 100 residents in the district, then you shall do this. But they didn't say that. They said if there are 100 in a development area. And so, in my opinion, you can pick and choose whether or not you're affecting residents. And maybe that's a good way to put it. I mean, your projects might not directly affect residents, and therefore, why would they need to weigh in on council matters? If you are going to affect them in some potential development fashion, then they should weigh in. And that was also the opinion of Mr. Piggott. He said that, he's like, no, development area means the area that, the impact area of your development projects. It's a very interesting statute, and I'm intrigued by the fact that they're very, it's a shall provision as far as creating the citizens council, but then they give you the ability to maneuver your development areas. It's interesting.
Mr. Guzak?
Yeah, I just had a question, because, in our tech village, is there a possibility with the tech village, we'd have 100 people in that section? I mean,
Yeah.
if that's what we designate these funds,
Well,
or would there not be? Because I know there's gonna be a lot of, some
8,000.
residential, but some businesses, do they count the business people that are working there as, it has to be
People
the
that live
actual
there.
people that own the property, right?
Oh, yeah, no, you're right, it's now.
It's
But-
who lives there now, and there's nobody, well, there's a
Right.
few people
Oh,
there,
okay, so
but-
tech village isn't really an issue then, right?
Well, if you
And
had,
it might not even be an issue, because they're not gonna own the land. I mean, people might come in to work there, the restaurants, all that other stuff that's gonna be there, but the actual physical people that own the property, is that what you're talking
well,
about?
you
with the
raise
100?
a really interesting idea. Let's say that our first development projects have development areas.
Right.
And let's say that our second wave of development projects have different development areas. And let's say that one of our first projects is to put in infrastructure for Tech Village, and then Tech Village it's at build out.
Right.
And our second tier of plans includes a development area that now includes the now occupied residential areas. It's possible, if the term development plan triggers a council, that you could have a council spring up after Tech Village is created, if they're in your area. So the answer is both. It's yes and no. I hope we have that problem.
Well, yeah, I would just.
Well, we have a motion on the floor. Is there
I'll
support
second,
for
I'll
it? or-
second.
Okay, there's support?
I
Okay.
have one question for Attorney Laddie. The DDA, you kind of lost me real quick. What I was thought, anytime, once we set our plan and our projects and our plan for the DDA, we can't divert from that. If we divert from that plan, don't we have to go through all the steps again? Go to the commissioners and get their buy-in, and go to the TIFs and.
We can amend our development plan and our TIF plan without going back to the taxing entities and asking their permission.
If we amend our map, though, then we would, if we
If you
change
amend your
it.
map, right, the district
We
map.
won't do the map, we're just trying
Right.
to.
Okay. Ms. Lane, can you call for the vote?
It's a roll call vote, gentlemen. Mr. Mansour,
Yes.
Mr. Thomas,
Yes.
Mr. Atkins?
Yes.
Mr. Guzak?
Yes.
Mr. Massey?
Yes.
Myself, yes. Mr. Supervisor?
Yes. So when would we like to, I think we're looking at probably our next meeting for having the board, me bringing the board forward, that I would recommend?
That would be my suggestion. And if, just like we do in our normal meetings, if you want to put information in the packet for you guys to consider for nomination and approval at your next Thursday meeting, that would be great.
And, I don't know, would you like, I think we could invite them as well to the meeting, so you can meet them and see who they are, if they'd like to attend, and maybe have them say a few words, I guess, if they're available. Okay, with that, I think the next item we had on our agenda was the board will review the treasurer's second quarter investment report. Mr. Guzak handed this out, I think, at our last meeting, right?
Right,
Or
September
Tuesday.
11th, right.
2 meters.
So, I've got to grab my copy, but go ahead, Mr. Guzak.
Yeah, basically, it's the same report that we've been presenting for the last 2, well, as long as I've been here. And I know there were some questions on it, so I'd just like to see what questions you had.
Mr. Treasurer, as I recall, I don't have my copy, there were some investments that, if I'm incorrectly, correct me, there were some investments that the dollar amount was great, but the percentage of return was low. And the dollar amount was great, but the amount invest was low, as I recall.
So you're saying the dollar amount was large, but the rate of return was small?
Yes.
That could be possible, but you just have to tell me which one, because we did shift some funds, and when you go to a shorter term, if you're shifting funds to make sure we get paid for OPEB or whatever, you don't get the return, because the farther out you go, the larger rate.
If you turn to page 5, I'll show you an example, I think, of what Mr. Massey's, page 5, you're looking at, on 6/7 of 18. You've got a CD with CIBC
Okay.
for $465,000 at 1.79%
Right.
for 35 days duration. Then below that, you have one with Michigan class,
Right.
money market at 2.7 or 2.07% for
Right.
35 days, and that one's 119,000.
Right. It's not the dollar amount that dictates the rate, it's the number of days, okay?
So those are both the same days, so we have,
Both some of them days, but you've got two different entities. You've got CIBC, which is a bank, and the Michigan class is a,
well, why won't we put the 465 all into the one that's paying 2% instead of the one paying 1.7? I'm just trying to understand
Oh, okay,
myself,
well,
but,
the
you know,
reason, we've got 5 different banks and then another institution, which is Michigan class. We're trying to spread and diversify all our funds, okay? I'd like to put it all with Michigan class, but then I'd have everything in one particular place. If something happens to them, our policy states you have to diversify your product, so I'm trying to spread it as far as I can. And it'd be a lot easier if I went to all Michigan class, because that's not even a CD, I can pull it at any point in time. And Michigan class is the premier one that's beating everybody, and that's why the rates are so superior.
so basically, it's because you want to spread it around, because it looks like
You have to
there's,
spread it around, yes.
there's quite a few at 35 days right there in that time
Right.
frame between 6/7 and 6/14. They're all 35 days.
Well, what happens is when you're going through this, when I recap it, I do it by date, okay, so then you're gonna see all that bracket, but depending on the particular day, you've got a lot of funds in, then you have to spread it, so then you spread it to the targets that you have to have. We've got payables twice a month, and we have payroll that's twice a month. Sometimes they fall on the same days, sometimes they don't, and so there's different needs, different target amounts for each time.
So like this date starting on 6/7, Mr. Guzak, like what we were looking at, it looks like there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 investments that all have a duration of 35 days. We've got CIBC, Michigan class, TCF, CIBC, and Flagstar.
Right.
So it looks like there's probably 300,000, looks like there's probably $1.5 million, well, $1.75 million, right? I don't know what those
Yeah,
are
a lot
all.
of money's been changed.
So is there something in 35 days after
Yes.
that was coming up due that
There
we
was
needed to
something that
have a
was
couple
due at the
million? or-
35, yes, that's exactly correct. On that particular date, 35 days later, I had to cover some payables that were expected. That's what we're trying to do. We're hitting a target, 35 days out, 45 days, or whatever. Each one of them have a target amount that I'm trying to reach. And you gotta remember, you get so many funds in, well, you can only fill the closest one first, because you can't put it too far out, because then if it's out in a CD, it doesn't do any good, because you've got money you need right now, but it's locked up for a longer period of time. So you're trying to fill all the potential targets.
Wow.
And this just shows they're all lined up, because it happens sporadically, and then you just line them all back up through both the funds, the general fund and the DPW fund, so it looks like there's 35 transactions that are in the general fund that particular quarter, where there's over 43 transactions for the DPW. So there's a lot of activity that's being done every week.
Mr. Atkins?
Just a couple questions. So, okay, I understand reading through here the diversification of investments. But if you look at page 8, so we're in, just one example, so we're only invested with Chase Bank 1%.
Right.
And that 1% represents money that's been sitting there for 205 days.
And what happens there is, it's 205 days because they pay hardly anything. Chase Bank doesn't need any funds, so they pay nothing. So I have the smallest amount possible with them. I just keep a small amount available, so if I do have to do something quickly, on each fund, maybe 200,000 each one, I can pull funds out of that just by, our actual finance director can pull it out, okay, if we need it. These other funds have to be pulled within time frames, like the next day or whatever. If it's liquid, I control it. If it's not, I have to wait for the CD. But the reason why it goes out 205 days is because it affects, if you want to do that, why would I want to use that money? I don't want to use it. I'm just trying to keep a small buffer, so I try to put out as far as I can, because the more times you put that in there, it brings down your overall average of investment.
It just looks to me like Chase Bank doesn't want our business,
They don't
so
want our
why
business,
don't we
no.
just divest from them completely? Because you're getting 0.05%, which is very close to starting to pay them to hold the $84,000.
Well, part of the problem is that they're our main bank that has all our accounts, so all our checking accounts, all our activities go through them. They're a very strong and stable bank. We've been with other banks prior to me getting here. We were with other banks that they had a lot of difficulty with, and this is a premier bank that we know the funds going in are obligations, and working with them to transfer all these funds, because there's a lot of funds that aren't ours that we collect for all the different entities. Because today we had to wire out $5 million on a settlement to the county, and of course we ended up with like $124,000 for that settlement, where the county got like $5 million. So we have to have a strong bank to do that, so that's why we're not investing with them, but we're using their expertise as far as all the other things that we need to process.
And then just my final question to that then, have you, this is a substantial amount of cash that we're investing throughout the year.
Right.
You know, if Chase Bank is only giving us
They're giving us nothing. I agree.
nothing, and we still have all of our business with them in terms of payroll or checking.
Well, it's basically the checking accounts and the processing and the systems that they have.
Have you had the bank representatives, like when's the last time you had them in to kind of compete for the business, or maybe it's time to change Chase out completely and find someone else that really wants to service the township, and give a little more. I think you can make more just having a basic checking account than the 0.05% interest. At that, I don't even know if they deserve to continue the business with the rest of the administrative portion of it that we're letting them do.
Well, it's kind of confusing in a way. Can I understand your point? This is showing the amount of money that's actually being invested. However, we do have offset balances that we're receiving from Chase, so that most of our fees are offset by our balances that go through. It's not this 2%, it's not this small amount that you're looking at. It's the other monies that are going through the transactions. So our fees, and we do work with them every year. We review that with them. And we've got a new system we're trying to try out, and we're not sure we're gonna stay with it, but they're trying to come with a positive pay, which is a lot of banks have, that way you send out a file, and that way it verifies the check. If that check doesn't match up with our file, they reject it immediately. So there's some steps other banks have to take, but we've got that. But we also we're trying to process the checks through our system with a scanner, and because it was supposed to save us money on fees, and then that way we'd have more money. But so far, it's been very time consuming, so we're not sure if we'll stay with that or not. And if that does, then who knows what happens to our offset balances, and then we'd have to go out to another bank and do what you're saying. But it is very difficult to do that, and you've got to be careful which bank you deal with, because I talked to the previous finance director when we had another bank, and I won't mention the names, but when they switched from another bank to this bank, they said it took them maybe 6 to 9 months to convince the other bank, no, you still owe us this money. You know, they have the balances, and we did, you know, I wasn't here at the time, but we did resolve it, but it took like 9 months to get the proper monies pulled out of that bank to get the other bank. And you would think it would not be that, it shouldn't be that hard, but it is. I mean, they'll say this or that, and I wasn't part of it, but I heard the tail end of it. So you know, we will definitely look at another bank when we have to, but that's not the main reason we're with them. We're with them through the other security reasons. But that was a good point to bring up.
So Mr. Laddie or Mr. Limita, Mr. Guzak brings up in our policy on diversification, and I probably should know what that is, but do we have a requirement to diversify? I know, you know, FDIC only covers up to a certain amount.
$250,000.
So I mean,
Well, actually,
obviously,
it's
we aren't
$500,000.
diversifying
Right.
because of that. We're just diversifying because we're concerned about the security of having all the money in one bank and having that bank fail, is that?
Well, and several years ago, that was a concern, right? In 2007 and 2008, there were banks that were failing. And so that was a legitimate problem that we had back then. And I'm trying to remember, I thought we looked at our investment policy
Yeah, we went through the
just
whole
within the
policy.
last 6 months, and
Right.
we tried to expand the definition of a financial institution or something. I remember we were trying to figure out how we can free ourselves from the limitation in that policy. I can't remember how we did that or if we adopted that or not, but I think that it's interesting because I know that Mr. Guzak and I went through, when the downturn occurred, it was a very scary time for our deposits, and especially when you had concerns of everybody, including Bank of America and Chase, being in trouble. And so I think that and I'll defer to that finance policy, or the investment policy, Mr. Guzak, but I think you probably find you have more freedom now than you did then, but.
Well, no, the policy hasn't changed. I mean, it's to protect the township and protect all our investments. And it's a short-term investment thing. And you're correct, we have 5 different banks, and now they're all B, and one's a B minus, where we had ones where we've actually had A banks, rated A, purchase CDs with them, and before the year was out, they were E banks. So we had to get out of those banks, take all the funds out when we could. We couldn't break the CDs because you would penalize more. Usually their penalties are higher than what you could make in interest, and you'd lose principal. So we did ride it out and had no losses or whatever. And then when they got the readings back up, we're back and reinvesting with some banks. But it was a scary time. But the policy is very strict and very strong, and we did review that policy.
So if we totaled up all these CDs and the Michigan class investment, whatever, how much money are we investing here on a regular basis?
Okay, you gotta remember, this is a snapshot in time.
Right.
This is only for 3 quarters, okay? And some of these will actually roll. The full amount might roll, so it's not there, but the total amount that we have invested right now is like 24 million, okay? There's not 24 million sitting here because you're only gonna see the activity. What you're trying to do with this report is, okay, is he investing something that's not in the policy, that's outside the policy, something that's not right? Okay, that's what this report is designed to show you, where it's going and what rates you're getting, and that we're within the policies.
On any given day, how much cash would we have, not necessarily on hand here, but liquid? Let's say that we had some kind of emergency. What kind of cash would we have on hand for an emergency that came up?
Well, I try to maintain about 35% liquid, so probably about $8 million if we had to do something drastic. But you got to remember, this $8 million is just not sitting there. It's actually in a target. Okay, it's in a target to fill a target that says, okay, on this particular day we need 500,000. And once it fills that, sometimes you have to fill it with you got to remember, I'm spreading it through all these entities. And Michigan Class is the one that pays the most, so I try to go with them as much as I can to get the higher value. Well, that will be placed in that target. But if I can later fill that with a CD, then that frees that liquid money back up again. So once I fill it the first time or wherever with liquid money, then I try to backfill it with CDs so I can take that liquid money and become liquid again. Because if it's locked down and you never move it, it looks like it's liquid, but it's actually assigned to a specific target, and if it's drawn, it's gonna be gone. So it's not really truly liquid. It is liquid, but it's being accounted for, and it's not.
Treasurer,
Mr. Thomas.
the $8 million, that's not liquid, that's in CDs right now. It's not,
No, that's in, most of it's in money it's in,
oh, well, okay, I'm sorry,
Restricted
money
class,
markets,
many
but it's being
markets.
invested.
it's invested, but not with CDs.
That's not what you said it was 8 million liquid.
Well, liquid means it's within money market. It's not sitting there
Right.
doing nothing.
I'm saying cash on hand that we would
That's
have.
what Scott's
Well,
asking.
cash on hand right now, there's probably $250 in our checking account, okay?
$250?
$250.
That makes me feel better.
$250. It's $250, that's our target, but remember, every day we
$250.
got deposits coming in, every day we got checks going out that are clearing.
The 8 million is part of the bucket system.
Mr.
Oh,
Mansour?
yes, it's in the
So,
bucket system.
did I hear this correctly, that we have $24 million that we invest on any given day?
Not on any given, that's the total amount that's out there, okay?
That's invested.
That's
with the
invested.
DPW enterprise fund.
Oh,
So on any given day, we've got 24 million invested.
on any given day, we have $24 million.
Well, it
invested.
goes up and down, depends on
Well,
what day,
but,
yeah.
I get the point, but
Right.
$24 million.
Yeah.
So,
And there isn't 24 million in this quarter here. If you add that up,
No,
you're not gonna see it.
okay, I get the point. So the question that I have is that we have a township that has an annual budget of 13, 14 million dollars?
Just roughly $15 million for the general fund.
But that
There's the
24 million
DPW.
includes DPW though, right?
Yeah.
The enterprise fund.
Right,
Correct.
So that enterprise fund
right.
The
isn't,
enterprise fund currently has about $14 million in their fund balance.
Okay.
which we have, how many in projects for the DPW lined up for the next several years?
It's about $26 million in the next 2
But we know when the cash needs for those projects are, right?
Yes.
I mean, that's not an unknown
For the
thing.
DPW projects?
So for that 14.
Well, we don't know exactly, 'cause
We know within a few months. But my point is that we have a huge chunk of money that we know basically when the chunks are gonna be needed. So we ought to be able to stage our investments to maximize, or to, in a safe way. That's the primary
they
thing,
are
a safe
staged.
way, to stage it so that, that we'll match the funding needs with the availability.
It is a huge sum of money,
I have a question for the
you know. Mr. Massey?
How long have you had this same outline for as investing? Have you revamped this in the last 20 years?
First of all, I haven't been here 20 years, but this particular system is the one that MTA educates all townships on, and it was done by our previous treasurer that set it up with the laddering CDs and trying to estimate out your payables.
My question really is, do you think it's still adequate?
Yes. It's kind of complicated, and if you want to go through it, I'd be glad to go. I did go through it with Trustee Thomas. He came in and spent some time, and I showed him what I had to do every week to try to do it. Like I said, it's trying to hit those targets, and sometimes you would think 2 months would be more than enough time to do anything, but if you set targets up and you set CDs up, 2 months doesn't give you anything. If something drastic happens, if we don't have liquid funds, 2 months won't do anything, because it's,
But it sounds like we have quite a bit of liquid funds.
but here again, it's liquid, it's sitting on targets, it's not just sitting nowhere, it's sitting on a target at that point in time, it has to cover a target, okay?
Okay.
And I try to take
So
all
how
of
much, I guess, how much untargeted money do we have? I guess maybe it'd be a better, untargeted liquid funds do we have? Let's say that there's a natural disaster and we need some cash. How much liquid, cash do we have that's not targeted in an investment of any form? Do
Well,
we keep on?
they're all targeted, like I said. So
So
they're,
basically, we got 250,000 basically right now that isn't in an investment vehicle of some sort that,
Well, the 250 is, but it's getting that measly amount that's sitting there, okay?
Right.
That's why you're seeing that.
But we could
0.05.
spend it tomorrow if we had to, that 250, so that's basically what we keep on hand is 250.
$250?
250,000, but that 250 doesn't do anything. I mean, you've got a water bill that's like $1 million, okay? A water bill from DPW is over $1 million. If they decide to not bill us this month and bill us next month, we could get a bill for $2 million instead of one, because they get behind in the processing. So it's not, it's a lot of juggling.
Exactly, that sounds like it. Mr. Atkins, you had a question?
Yeah, I've got two other questions. So the money that you consider liquid, you said is in money markets, not CDs, correct?
Right. That's, but it is targeted in a particular target date.
Right. Would you consider the money market then more flexible in terms of getting the cash when you need it?
Oh, absolutely. Money markets I can get the next day. I just call them up and say I gotta have it. And what I can do is, here again, you're trying to target it out farther months out, okay? So if I've got liquid money targeted out farther, which I usually try to do, but then I try to backfill it with CDs, if I need the money right away, I can go out there like in November, I don't have any in November, but the farthest date I've got out, I just pull that cash out of there because I won't need it for like 2 or 3 months, right? So I can pull money from all these different accounts, from all those targets that are assigned, and then I have to reassign them again. You know, because it's a constant juggling. Okay, I have money in here, well then I'll take it out, and I constantly do that. And try to balance it.
How do you get all those targets? Because, for example, if...
Well, I have a calendar that's been set up.
If the chief has cars that, you know, a year from now are going to be purchased, or DPW has a generator that is gonna cost $30,000 and all these different, I'm just wondering how you get all these targets from everybody unless they come before our board and say, hey, we're gonna plan to buy this on X date. You know,
Yeah, if they don't, that's part of the problem. If you're not, nobody says enough to me, then there's a possibility that we might have it. But when you have that liquid cash that I'm talking about that's being invested, and the liquid one for the other one's the highest paying one anyway. At one point in time, though, Michigan Class, I had stuff with them, and then there was like 4 or 5 years where I had nothing with them. They could not pay anything, okay?
Because we sprung one on you tonight, maybe, with talking about the 180,000 or whatever it is with the road commission that we may need next year that really hasn't been targeted.
Right, and that's why I try to keep like 30-some% liquid, so that if something comes up, we don't have to, you know, because we don't want to borrow money, we don't have a line of credit, we don't want to spend money on interest, we want to make interest. That's why we try to juggle it and then try to spread it within as many, 6 different entities, so that it balances, because that's what the policy says. It says you can't stick it in one. You have to diversify it to make sure that, you know, and like Mr. Lighty said, it'll probably never happen, but that's not what our policy says. Our policy says you better be diversified.
So, Mr. Lima, I'm just wondering, you know, that if this conversation is, I mean, this is, you know, treasurer's, you know, work, what have you, versus operations work. I don't know where that line is drawn between what is operations and what is board when it comes to this financial information. Can you help me at all understand that better?
Sure, this is all really, you know, the treasurer statutorily is in charge of investing your funds, and so it really is, it's a function of the board. The reporting goes back to you guys as really the treasurer's, as required by investment policy, is just his reporting back to the board on where his investments are and what that looks like. So operationally, we don't drive any of this, we don't steer any of this. This is really the treasurer, and your terms of your investment policy. And of course, earlier this year, we sat down and went through the investment policy. I think there's some things you can look at there. But again, like from diversification, what does that mean? Does it mean you have to have 5 banks, or does it mean that you can put it in Michigan Class, which is already a diversified, you know, you're already carrying a diversified portfolio. Right. If you put it all in Michigan Class, did you satisfy the investment policy? That's a
So how many
question
banks
that-
does Michigan Class use?
They don't have banks. They got commercial paper and other stuff.
Right.
But is it like one, or is it, I mean, they invest in a whole bunch of things.
It's a pool investment.
It's like
There's a
$13
ton of people
billion.
buying into Michigan Class, and they're invested all over the place.
So it's diversified in itself.
Right.
And the interest rate on that Michigan Class, is that substantially higher than what
That's
we're getting?
higher than anything, yes.
I mean, your most recent reports showing Michigan class is definitely higher, and then again, it's money
Except-
markets, it's true, it's liquid, he can go get the cash anytime he needs. So I mean, you can see why he invests in Michigan class, because it is a diversified, it's already diversified, and
Right.
he can go grab the cash when he needs it from a.
So when we look at the interest that we're getting from all of our investments, Michigan class, I think, from what I saw, was substantially more than
Well-
anything else.
But that's changing though, because now I'm getting CDs that are beating Michigan class. Okay, gotta remember, Michigan class is liquid. I just booked a CD for 230, which is, you know, Michigan class is about 117. They've been as high as 118, but they're starting to go down a little bit, but now my CDs are starting to go up. And here again, that's why you gotta have a combination of both, and so they don't have the highest return, but they're liquid, and they've got the highest liquid return of anyone. But I've had a couple banks that, you know, I keep talking to them and discussing it, and I've had some of them bump it up, and they're getting closer because they know they want to get more of my funds. And I said, well, that's fine. I'm getting this from this bank or this bank. Can you help me out or not?
All right.
And some of them will, and some of them won't, because they've got standards or policy that their bank says, no, this is what we're going to do. We're not going any higher. I mean, everybody has guidelines.
Okay, I think Mr. Massey had a question, then Ms. Lane. And then
How
we'll.
much time do you spend on tracking this information?
Well, probably every week I have to do it, okay, and usually at least 2 days a week. I'm working on this stuff to make sure, because you're doing a lot of juggling, and you're trying to foresee a lot of things like you're saying. We don't know what's going to happen on certain things, and so you're trying to figure out different ways. The basic structure's the same, but the way that I'm funding it, I'm changed that over the years, because I've learned from experience. Things do happen, and you're trying to, if you get burnt once, you don't want to get burnt twice, right? So you say, well, I'm not going to do that again, so I gotta do this.
Yep.
Like I used to go over a year on banks. Well, then I got burnt. I had CDs sitting there, and they went to an E, and I had to sit there and watch this thing to make sure they didn't go under. And I never lost any money, but you're always worried about it, because it's not my money, it's the township's money. My responsibility is to protect that money. And luckily, those banks have come back up, but it doesn't mean you didn't worry about the whole time it was sitting out there for 9 months when they're sitting as an E.
All right, let's wrap this up. Ms. Lane, you had a question?
I didn't have a question, I had a statement. I think that sometimes what I think this board, with their lack of knowledge, is funneling their thoughts at a very short period of time. And Mr. Guzak, with his experience, has spread it out, because we have to use those funds for an entire year and overlapping another year. So
I see it as
I'm
a.
glad people scrutinizing it, that's fine.
Well, that's
But I
fine.
don't
They
think
need to-
they
they
have the
need-
depth of
that's fine. I'm glad
expertise
you
that
asked
Mr.
The only way they're
Guzak
gonna
has.
find out the information is asked. and
Right,
I
that's
appreciate
absolutely
the
correct.
question,
That's
so
fine.
Right.
the board can ask away. I appreciate them
Right.
taking the responsibility seriously.
Well, I
With
do too.
that, thank you very much, Mr. Guzak, for
Do you
the
want a motion,
run-through
Mr.
of that.
Chair?
We don't have
To
to.
accept the
There's
resignation?
no need.
Okay.
Okay, moving on to next item, what are we hearing from the community? Mr. Mansour?
So I have two things, I guess. Again, coming off of the Ally Challenge week here, week ago, the question's about, really how much economic benefit does this bring to the township? Is there some way we can engage our connections with the chamber or others to kind of help quantify that, just to publicize?
We'll talk, and I think, the charities obviously are going to have,
Sure.
they're going to be getting checks from the
But
LA Chamber.
restaurants and all the rest
Right,
of that, I
right.
mean, our hotels and things.
Good
So-
question.
So that's a question, if we can have some action around that. And then the second thing is that the board here received a email from Mr. Foote regarding McFarland Library and expense there. And I'm wondering, I'm just treating Mr. Foote as a citizen and ask if we need to do anything with that.
Mr. Limita?
So I do have that slated for being on your next agenda to consider they want to replace that HVAC system. The city has approved 20,000. I think they're looking at you guys approving whatever it is, 40,000. It will be for your consideration on your next agenda. You know, this was an unbudgeted expense. You'll have to do an amendment and a transfer out of capital projects to McFarland Library if that's what the board decides to do. So, what we need to probably do, my suggestion would be to work with them on putting together, you know, like a 5-year projection of what anticipated projects were, so we could better manage that through the capital projects fund.
Thank you.
Mr. Atkins?
Could someone just explain to me why it's not 50/50?
As far as the expenditure for the McFarland Library?
Correct, the city funding 20,000 of the potential repair and us potentially 40,000?
They have, it's one of those agreements that predated myself, obviously, and they've done, the library was a 60/40, like the senior center was a 60/40 deal, and that's kind of, I don't know the origin of how they arrived at that number. To be honest with you, Trustee Atkins, no one's been able to ever explain it to me. I think it was kind of like a population split maybe at the time that they
Population
formed it.
tax.
Okay, thanks.
Anything else that anyone's here in the community? I can just say that the response I heard, you know, from the Ally Challenge was very favorable. I don't know if all of you had the opportunity to go out, but our police, fire, anybody else who was involved, I think the volunteers, you know, was a very good showing. The crowds were great. The players and the network TV stations were impressed with the crowds that we had out there. Everybody was very well behaved, from what I understand. The concert was phenomenal in terms of the venue. The group was well received. We had, I think, if they continue with that event, it will definitely grow. I think just a perfect setup for the concert. But I haven't heard any negatives at all. Parking seemed to be handled very professionally and smoothly. I think, you know, people going across Saginaw Street was handled very well, even with, you know, the crowd that let out after the concert. So I was very impressed with the organization. I think it helped that we had another tournament here for so long, that some of that institutional knowledge was still here and worked very well. Ms. Lane?
I would like to remind the public that October the 9th is the last day to register if you want to vote in the November 6th election. And we still have not received our ballots to do all of our pre-testing and everything, but we have several thousand people already that are going to be getting AV ballots.
Okay, moving on to future agenda items. I think one of the things we wanted to discuss was our budget discussion and how we're going to handle that. I think in discussing with Mr. Limit that we wanted to take a deeper dive into our police budget and take a look at what's going to be needed in the future and what we currently have. I think we're looking at our October 9th meeting of doing the police. And then from hearing from a number of you, we're looking at the DPW for another deep dive and looking at the 11th for that, which would be that Thursday. And then on the meeting of the 23rd, if there's any others that we want to look at, we can do that on that fourth Tuesday meeting on the 23rd.
Supervisor Bennett, would that mean that we are we are reserving time on the existing agendas for that, or are we adding additional time?
Well, I guess it all depends on if you, I mean, we'll have other agenda items on those evenings, but we're going to place it as an agenda item was my plan, and whatever time it takes. Mr. Limita?
One suggestion that the board might like to consider is that we block out an hour for budget review, so that if you have a lot of other agenda items, you're not here till 11:30 at night, and then if we don't get our questions answered in that hour, then that would carry over to the 11th. We just block out that hour, and it's a budget discussion, and if we didn't finish the police, then the police would come back on the 11th. Transition to DPW or whichever department the board would like to.
I think, you know, we all have the budget, so we can start looking over now, so those meetings won't necessarily have to go necessarily through the whole thing, but we can ask some of our questions, and even in advance if you'd like to, you know, so that they're prepared to answer them. Mr. Atkins?
I just ask if there's if we could, I know things come up, but if we could limit the agenda on those meetings to anything big, so we don't get sidetracked or distracted. I don't think there's anything real big coming down in the next.
We'll have to approve our DDA board, which would be looking at doing that on the 11th, but I don't think,
Okay.
if you guys approve who I'm bringing forward, it shouldn't be a problem. Never know.
When are you gonna tell us, is the question?
I will send out in advance of that meeting, the individuals and a little bit of biographical information on each of them, so that you know before the meeting
Thank you.
who is on that slate. But I think, yes, Mr. Mansur.
So I make a motion to adjourn the meeting?
Is there anything else that, Mr. Laddie, Mr. Lemon?
No, sir.
Okay, motion to adjourn. There was support?
Yes,
Support.
Mr. Massey.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay.
Sir, when are you gonna go after the bond?